My dad disowned my sister and he is dying. How do I convince her to let him go? It was a typical Saturday in 2003, the kind where nothing seemed out of place. The house was quiet, except for the occasional laughter from the TV in the living room where Dad was going through some old mail that had piled up. Little did we know, that pile held a ticking time bomb that was about to blow our family apart. Dad was the kind of guy who liked to keep things organized, always trying to clear out junk mail and old bills on the weekends. But that day, he found something far different. An envelope that was neither a bill nor a simple letter from a friend. It was a series of romantic messages and hotel receipts, all pointing to one undeniable fact. Mom was having an affair. And not just with anyone, but with John, his childhood best friend. John and Dad were inseparable since grade school, sharing everything from baseball cards to life's biggest moments. John was more than a friend. He was the brother Dad never had. He was even the best man at my parents' wedding, standing proudly by Dad's side as he vowed to love Mom for better or worse. The irony of those vows now lay bare, revealed in the cruelest way possible. When Dad first saw those receipts and love notes, he sat there in disbelief. His hands trembled as he tried to piece together the timeline, the secret meetings, the betrayal from the two people he trusted most. It felt like a slap in the face, a betrayal that reached into the deepest part of his heart and tore it out. I was home that day, in my room, working on a school project, oblivious to the storm brewing downstairs. It wasn't until I heard a loud thud that I went down to check. There was Dad sitting on the floor, receipts and letters scattered around him, his face the picture of anguish. "What's wrong, Dad?" I asked, kneeling beside him, trying to make sense of the scattered papers. He didn't answer at first, just shook his head as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. With a shaky voice, he managed to put words to his pain. "It's your mom. And John. They've been seeing each other. Look at this," he said, handing me a hotel receipt dated just last week. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily between us. I didn't know what to say or do. My mind raced with images of Mom and John, the times they had been a little too friendly, their laughter a bit too loud. It all made a twisted sense now. Dad spent the next hour explaining everything he had found. With each detail, his voice grew more resigned, a man coming to terms with his shattered reality. He had always been the strong one, the problem solver, the foundation of our family. Seeing him like this, broken and defeated, was something I had never prepared for. The days that followed were a blur of hushed phone calls and closed-door conversations. Dad confronted Mom, who at first denied everything, but the evidence was too damning to ignore. She finally admitted to the affair, her words hollow, her excuses flimsy. "I just fell out of love and John was there," she said, her voice void of the warmth it once had. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Sorry. The word echoed through the house, mocking the years of love and sacrifice Dad had poured into our family. He begged her to reconsider, to go to counseling, to try to mend what had been broken. But it was too late. Mom had made up her mind she was leaving him for John. The news spread like wildfire, each of us kids reacting in our own way. Disbelief, anger, sadness, it all melded into a tumultuous storm that threatened to rip our family even further apart. Sarah, my twin sister, took it the hardest. She had always been the apple of Dad's eye, the one who could do no wrong. Yet in the weeks that followed, her demeanor changed. She grew distant, her visits home less frequent, her conversations with Dad strained and awkward. It was as if she blamed him for not being enough, for not keeping Mom happy. But I knew it was more complicated than that. It was about her loyalties being tested, her life being uprooted. Mom and John moved in together not long after the divorce papers were filed. It was quick, almost ruthlessly so. They settled in a fancy part of town, and soon enough, it seemed like Mom had a whole new life, one that didn't include us unless it was convenient. Dad, on the other hand, tried to keep things as normal as possible for us, but the strain was evident. He lost weight, his smiles became rarer, and the light in his eyes dimmed. Looking back, I realized that day marked the end of many things, of trust, of family unity, and of the innocence that once colored our daily lives. Dad's discovery wasn't just about infidelity, it was the unraveling of the tapestry of our family, thread by thread, until we were just individuals, struggling to understand how the warmth and love we once shared had turned into cold, hard betrayal. As I watched Dad try to rebuild his life, his spirit bruised but not broken, I learned about the resilience of the human heart. But the scars remained, a constant reminder of the day our family changed forever. After the storm that was Mom's departure, the house felt different, emptier somehow. even with all of us still living there. Dad did his best to keep things normal, but you could tell he was just going through the motions. His heart wasn't in it anymore, and who could blame him? His best friend and wife had turned his life upside down. In the middle of all this chaos was Sarah, my twin sister, who had always been Dad's little girl. You'd think she'd stick by him through something like this, right? But things didn't turn out that way. Instead, Sarah became more and more withdrawn from Dad, and as time went by, closer to Mom, and by extension, to John. It was like watching someone switch sides in slow motion. Sarah's decision to stay with Mom after she moved out was a shock to all of us. Sure, she was 27 and made her own decisions, but this was different. It felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. Dad tried to hide his disappointment, but there was a hurt in his eyes that was hard to miss. He'd lost his wife, and now it felt like he was losing his daughter too. The whole dynamic in our family shifted. Weekends, which used to be loud and full of life, became tense and awkward. Sarah would come over, and it was clear she was just going through the motions. Conversations were stilted, filled with long silences where there used to be laughter. It was like she was a guest in her own home, unsure of her place or what to say. Things got even more complicated when Sarah announced she was thinking of changing her career path. From as early as I can remember, she'd wanted to be a doctor, like Dad. He was a surgeon, and she'd always said she wanted to follow in his footsteps. But suddenly, she was talking about going to law school instead. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Mom and John were behind this. They were both lawyers, and it seemed they had their own plans for her. Dad was crushed. It was one thing to lose his wife to his best friend, but losing his daughter's aspirations too? That was a different kind of pain. He tried to talk to her about it, tried to understand her decision, but Sarah was adamant. "It's just something I need to do for myself," she'd say, but her words felt hollow. It was clear this wasn't just about her. John became a constant presence in her life, mentoring her, helping her with her law school applications, and even offering her a job at his firm once she graduated. It was like he was grooming her to take his place, erasing the parts of her that reminded him of Dad. The change in Sarah was hard to watch. She became more like Mom. Ambitious, sure, but also distant and calculating. The warmth that used to define her seemed to fade, replaced by a cool professionalism that didn't quite fit. Dad, for all his heartache, never stopped trying to reach out to her. He supported her decision to go to law school, despite his own reservations. He showed up at her graduation, beaming with pride, even though it was John's firm she'd be joining and not some prestigious hospital. The divide grew deeper with every passing year. Holidays were especially hard. Sarah would show up, but she was always in a hurry to leave, to get back to her new life with Mom and John. It felt like we were just checkboxes on her list of obligations, not her family. And it wasn't just Dad who felt the shift. The rest of us did too. We tried to understand, to be supportive, but it was tough. We missed our sister, the one who used to sneak out with us to go to movies, who'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing. That Sarah was gone, and in her place was someone we barely recognized. It wasn't just the personal changes that stung. It was the feeling of injustice, of seeing someone you love choose the people who had caused so much pain over the family that had always been there for her. Every visit, every forced conversation was a reminder of what we'd lost. As Dad's health began to decline, a mix of stress, heartache, and perhaps just the weight of carrying too much for too long, I watched him try to reconcile the image of the daughter he raised with the woman Sarah had become. He still loved her, that was clear, but there was a resignation in his love now, a sadness that spoke of things irrevocably changed. Looking back, those years were a slow unraveling of the tight-knit family we once were. We were all dealing with the fallout in our own ways, but for Dad, the betrayal was a double-edged sword, cutting deep and leaving wounds that no amount of time seemed able to heal. Sarah's shift in allegiance didn't just change her relationship with Dad, it changed her relationship with all of us. We became bystanders in her transformation, witnesses to a shift that none of us had wanted, but all of us had to accept. It was a painful realization, understanding that sometimes, no matter how much you want to hold on, you have to let go. And let go we did, each of us adjusting to the new normal in our own way, holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could one day be mended. But as each day passed, that hope grew dimmer, overshadowed by the reality of our fragmented family. 2017 was supposed to be a good year, a fresh start, or so we hoped. Sarah was getting married, and despite all the undercurrents of tension, there was a buzz of excitement around the event. Dad, ever the optimist, was determined to make the best of it. He had always looked forward to seeing Sarah in a wedding dress, walking her down the aisle, and handing her off to a new life of happiness. It was supposed to be one of those key moments, a bright spot in the messy aftermath of our family's split. Sarah had always known how much this meant to Dad. We all did. So when Dad wrote her a blank check for the wedding, it wasn't just about the money. It was a gesture, his way of saying he was still there for her, no matter what. He talked about it constantly whenever weddings came up on TV or when we attended one as guests. "When it's your turn, Sarah," he'd say, "it's going to be just perfect." The planning went on for months, and Dad was involved every step of the way. Despite their strained relationship, he never let his personal feelings toward Mom and John interfere with his efforts to be there for Sarah. He attended every tasting, every dress fitting, always enthusiastic, always supportive. But then, just one day before the wedding, everything came crashing down. Sarah dropped the news casually, almost too casually, during what we thought was a final routine check-in. "Oh, by the way, I decided that John and Dad are both going to walk me down the aisle," she said, flipping through her planner, not even looking up. The room went still. You could almost hear the collective heart drop. Dad's face, I will never forget it. It was as if someone had punched him right in the gut. The hurt was palpable, etched deep in his expression. "Both of us. Why?" His voice was calm, but you could hear the tremor of suppressed emotion. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes flicking between Dad and me as if she was weighing how much to reveal. "Well, John's been a big part of my life too, you know. It just feels right to have you both there." Dad tried to process it, to understand her point of view, but it was clear he was struggling. "But Sarah, I always thought—" His voice trailed off, the sentence unfinished, the dream unfulfilled. The argument that followed was unlike any we had witnessed before in our family. Dad, usually the peacemaker, the one who avoided confrontation at all costs, couldn't hold back. His pain, his disappointment, it all came pouring out in a torrent of words that seemed foreign coming from him. "You want him there after everything? After what they did?" Dad's voice rose, a rare occurrence that marked the gravity of his feelings. Sarah was defensive, her words sharp and cutting. "John is my family too, Dad. He's been there for me in ways you just haven't been lately." That stung. Watching Dad's face crumple at her words was almost too much to bear. The fight escalated, voices raised, harsh words thrown like daggers, slicing through the thin veneer of familial bonds. In the end, Dad couldn't do it. The thought of standing next to John, the man who helped dismantle his marriage, his family, and smiling for the cameras was too much. "If that's your decision, Sarah, then I can't be a part of this," he said, his voice broken. Sarah tried to call his bluff, thinking perhaps he would cave, but Dad was resolute. He didn't attend the wedding. Instead, he stayed home, alone, drowning his sorrows in silence and solitude, while Sarah walked down the aisle with John by her side. The fallout from that decision was monumental. Our family, already cracked and strained, splintered even further. Dad and Sarah's relationship, once the cornerstone of his happiness, crumbled into non-existence. Many in the family sided with Dad, viewing Sarah's decision as the ultimate betrayal, not just of her father, but of all the values we thought we shared. After the wedding, Sarah reached out several times, trying to mend fences. But Dad was done. His heart, once open and forgiving, had hardened. The wedding photos, which should have been a treasure, became a symbol of what was lost. They showed a beaming Sarah, beautiful in her dress, but beside her, instead of Dad, was John, smiling broadly as if he hadn't a care in the world. The years that followed were tough. Sarah's attempts at reconciliation were met with cold indifference from Dad. Births, holidays, family gatherings. She was either absent or, if present, treated with a chilly politeness that was far worse than outright anger. Even as Dad's health began to decline, the wounds of the wedding day festered, unresolved and painful. The man who had once been the life of every party, the heart of our family, had retreated into a shell of his former self, his joy dimmed by the shadows of past hurts. And as I watched all this unfold, I wondered if there would ever be a way back for Sarah and Dad, or if some choices once made left scars too deep to ever fully heal. Dad's health started to decline rapidly earlier this year, and with it, any hope of reconciling with Sarah seemed to slip away too. The man who had once been larger than life, always the first to crack a joke or offer a comforting word, was now a shadow of his former self. Pancreatic cancer is ruthless, and it wasn't giving Dad any breaks. Watching him struggle through treatment after treatment with no real hope of recovery was probably one of the hardest things our family has ever had to endure. Throughout this ordeal, Sarah's attempts to reconnect felt desperate and, to some of us, a bit insincere. Maybe that's unfair. She probably did have regrets, and maybe her reaching out was genuine. But to Dad, it was too little, too late. The hurt from the wedding, from her choosing John over him, had cut too deep. He had closed that chapter of his life, and no amount of pleading or apologies from Sarah could open it again. Why now? Dad would mutter whenever her name came up. She's just feeling guilty, that's all. It's not about me. It's about her clearing her conscience. Maybe he was right. Or maybe it was his way of coping with the pain. Either way, he was adamant about not seeing her, not even when she offered to come over, to try to make amends, to be part of his life again. The tension this created within our family was palpable. Some relatives thought Dad should forgive her, to not let these final days be shadowed by past conflicts. She's still your daughter, they'd argue, as if the biological tie should automatically override the years of hurt and betrayal. But Dad was stubborn, and his decision was final. He didn't want her there, and that was that. It's weird, how illness can change a person. Dad, once the most forgiving soul, had become hardened, more cynical. It wasn't just the cancer eating away at his body, it was the bitterness, the unresolved anger. We all felt it, a heavy cloud hanging over the house, making those last few months even more strained. Sarah, for her part, didn't push too hard. Maybe she finally understood the depth of Dad's feelings, or maybe she was protecting herself from further rejection. She sent cards, called occasionally, always checking in with me or my other siblings to see how he was doing, but she never came to visit, not once. Then, as Dad's days became numbered, the reality of losing him hit us all like a ton of bricks. I found myself torn, wanting to honor his wishes but also wishing for a Hollywood-style reunion where everything was magically resolved. Real life isn't like the movies, though. There are no neat endings, no perfect resolutions where everyone hugs and forgives just before the credits roll. I spent a lot of time with Dad during those last weeks, just sitting with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching old westerns on TV. He loved those. In those quiet moments, I'd sometimes bring up Sarah, tentatively, testing the waters. But he'd shake his head, shutting down the conversation before it could really start. "Let's just enjoy the movie," he'd say, and I'd let it go, knowing this was not a battle I could win. Dad's health started to decline rapidly earlier this year, and with it, any hope of reconciling with Sarah seemed to slip away too. The man who had once been larger than life, always the first to crack a joke or offer a comforting word, was now a shadow of his former self. Pancreatic cancer is ruthless, and it wasn't giving Dad any breaks. Watching him struggle through treatment after treatment, with no real hope of recovery, was probably one of the hardest things our family has ever had to endure. Throughout this ordeal, Sarah's attempts to reconnect felt desperate and to some of us, a bit insincere. Maybe that's unfair. She probably did have regrets, and maybe her reaching out was genuine. But to Dad, it was too little. Too late. The hurt from the wedding, from her choosing John over him, had cut too deep. He had closed that chapter of his life, and no amount of pleading or apologies from Sarah could open it again. "Why now?" Dad would mutter whenever her name came up. "She's just feeling guilty, that's all. It's not about me, it's about her clearing her conscience." Maybe he was right, or maybe it was his way of coping with the pain. Either way, he was adamant about not seeing her, not even when she offered to come over, to try to make amends, to be part of his life again. The tension this created within our family was palpable. Some relatives thought Dad should forgive her, to not let these final days be shadowed by past conflicts. "She's still your daughter," they'd argue, as if the biological tie should automatically override the years of hurt and betrayal. But Dad was stubborn, and his decision was final. He didn't want her there, and that was that. It's weird, how illness can change a person. Dad, once the most forgiving soul, had become hardened, more cynical. It wasn't just the cancer eating away at his body, it was the bitterness, the unresolved anger. We all felt it, a heavy cloud hanging over the house, making those last few months even more strained. Sarah, for her part, didn't push too hard. Maybe she finally understood the depth of Dad's feelings, or maybe she was protecting herself from further rejection. She sent cards, called occasionally, always checking in with me or my other siblings to see how he was doing. But she never came to visit, not once. Then, as Dad's days became numbered, the reality of losing him hit us all like a ton of bricks. I found myself torn, wanting to honor his wishes, but also wishing for a Hollywood-style reunion where everything was magically resolved. Real life isn't like the movies, though. There are no neat endings, no perfect resolutions where everyone hugs and forgives just before the credits roll. I spent a lot of time with Dad during those last weeks, just sitting with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching old westerns on TV. He loved those. In those quiet moments, I'd sometimes bring up Sarah, tentatively, testing the waters. But he'd shake his head, shutting down the conversation before it could really start. "Let's just enjoy the movie," he'd say, and I'd let it go, knowing this was not a battle I could win. I'm very close to my dad, and these last few weeks are really difficult for me. How do I convince her to let him go? Update 1. A week after I posted the original post, my dad started getting worse. His health started declining really fast, and we lost him exactly 1 month ago. It wasn't pretty. I never thought it would be, but I never thought it would be that heartbreaking. It was in a lot of pain. He's been through so much in these last months, as heartbreaking as it was to us. He deserved to rest. He was tired. In the end, he was lucid enough to say his goodbyes to me and my older brothers. Hearing him saying what he said to me was one of the most painful and beautiful moments of my life. His words to me meant a lot. I won't say exactly what he said because I believe it's just too personal. Said goodbye to my daughters, 11 months old and 2 years old. It was just like when I was a kid. He gave them a kiss on the forehead, told them to be good girls, and said that he loved them. It was something I won't ever forget. And it hurts like hell that they are so young to understand what happened. They still ask about Grandpa. And every time I try to explain to them that he isn't coming back, they don't seem to understand that. And how can I blame them? I'm only 27 years old. They honestly don't get it. I was supposed to get a lot more years with my dad. It doesn't seem fair at all. But the worst part was my twin sister, Sarah. Dad died without speaking to her. I tried to talk to him about her, but he wasn't interested in speaking with her. She started getting more desperate, and suddenly, he died. It was expected, but she was in denial. His funeral was beautiful. A lot of people shared their stories about him. It was nice. Sarah saw Dad for the first time since the night before her wedding, and she didn't recognize him. He was very skinny. Dad was always a bit overweight, the famous dad bod, but he had lost a lot of weight from cancer. She cried a lot during the whole funeral. Mom and John tried to show up at the ceremony, and my uncles were forced to kick them out of the funeral. Good fricking Britain's dads will once, as expected as it could, Dan's family came from old money, petrochemicals. So he always had a lot of money. He left a little bit of money in properties divided equally to all his kids, including Sarah. He'll have a trust fund, which was a lot of money for all his grandkids, including Sarah's kids, which she never met. It was honestly expected. My dad never really cared about money that much. He just wanted us to be comfortable and sure that his grandkids all had something to support them. The tricky part was the personal things. He left a really big letter to all of us, except Sarah. It was really personal stuff. In my letter, he spoke to me about our story, about my childhood. It was really nice. I must have read the letter like 100 times, and I cried every single time. One of Dad's favorite hobbies was photography. He was quite an enthusiast, and a subject of his photos was pretty much our family. When he and Mom were together later, it turned out to be just me and my siblings. As a result of this, we had a lot of pictures from us growing up. He gave each of us a photo album, and behind each photo he wrote something where it was taken. Add a few words. I was honestly very surprised with us. He must have done this long before he died. It was a very thoughtful goodbye gift, something that was very typical of Dad. Sarah didn't get any letter, and her album didn't have anything. Roads behind her photos. And when she found out about this, she had a mental breakdown. The regrets was eating her alive. Still, as she was admitted to a hospital and spent an entire week there. She's doing a bit better now, getting a little better every day. Her husband and I are really confident in her recovery. She's sleeping and eating almost normally now. She still starts to cry randomly, multiple times on a daily basis, but is getting better. At least that's what I'm telling. So myself. Which brings us to last week. My wife and I discovered that we are expecting again. It wasn't planned or anything like that. My wife switched birth control last month, and she spends a week without taking the pill. It's still very early in her pregnancy, so we haven't told anyone yet. The thing is that I'm really angry. I'm angry that my future kid is not going to be able to meet Dad. I'm freaking pissed. Honestly, it doesn't seem fair at all. I'm angry and I'm scared. My dad was supposed to guide me in the whole parenthood process. He was teaching me a lot with my daughters. Now I'm scared of doing this without him. I'm scared of not being a good father like he was to me, because my kids deserve that. This is it, folks. This whole situation could be a lot better at play. The what-if scenario in my head every day. Unfortunately, it doesn't change anything. This is honestly a bitter ending. Doesn't seem fair at all. That's the thing about life. It's actually never fair. I want to thank everyone who gave me advice and to everyone who reached out and offered their support in the chat. I was very lonely at the time. Still am. It's meant a lot to me. Thank you. Reddit. Update 2. After Dad died, Sarah was in pieces. She'd been carrying around this guilt about how things ended between her and Dad, and it was eating her alive. She spent weeks crying, barely eating, and just trying to figure out how to move forward. I was trying to be there for her as best as I could, but it wasn't easy. I was dealing with my own grief, my own anger at how things had played out, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to handle her breakdown on top of everything else. Then, just when I thought maybe, just maybe, we could start picking up the pieces, Mom dropped a bomb on us. She called me up one night, completely out of the blue, and said she needed to talk. I could hear it in her voice that something was really wrong, so I went over to her place, dreading whatever it was she was about to say. When I got there, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone like it had personally offended her. She looked up at me with these tired eyes and just said, "John's been cheating on me." It was like the air got sucked out of the room. I didn't know what to say, how to react. I mean, this was the guy she'd left Dad for, the guy who had caused so much pain in our family, and now he was betraying her too? She told me how she found out. Apparently, she'd noticed he was being more secretive lately, always guarding his phone, taking calls in the other room. She didn't want to believe it at first, thought maybe she was just being paranoid. But then she saw the messages. Texts from some younger woman, complete with all the flirty emojis and late-night "I miss you" crap that makes your skin crawl. Mom confronted John, hoping he'd deny it, maybe even apologize and beg for forgiveness. But instead, he just admitted to it, like it was no big deal. He didn't even seem sorry, just kind of shrugged it off, saying something about how things just happen and how their relationship wasn't what it used to be. It was the kind of response that made you realize just how little he actually cared about anyone but himself. Mom was devastated. She told him she wanted a divorce right then and there. John didn't even try to fight it, didn't try to save their marriage. He just agreed, like he was relieved she was the one making the decision. It was over as quickly as it had started. Hearing all of this from Mom, I felt this weird mix of emotions. On one hand, I was furious at John for being such a scumbag, for hurting my mom the way he did. But on the other hand, there was this twisted sense of justice in it. He was finally getting a taste of his own medicine, and I couldn't help but feel a little satisfied that he was getting what he deserved. But the real shock came when Sarah found out. She'd been so close to John, had practically chosen him over Dad, and now this? When Mom told her, it was like watching someone's whole world crumble in front of you. Sarah completely broke down. She kept saying she couldn't believe she'd defended him, that she'd pushed Dad away for this man who turned out to be just as bad as everyone had warned her. Sarah's guilt went into overdrive. She started replaying everything in her head, the way she'd treated Dad, the things she'd said, the decisions she'd made, and now all of it felt so meaningless, so stupid. She was angry, but more than that, she was heartbroken. The person she thought she could trust had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and it shattered her. She moved out of the house she and John had been living in and went to stay with a friend. She couldn't stand to be around him, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. It was like every good memory she had with him was tainted. Every kind word he'd ever said turned into a lie. Mom, meanwhile, was dealing with her own mess. The divorce was ugly. John tried to get as much out of it as he could, even though he was the one who had cheated. There were arguments over money, property, everything. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing you couldn't do anything to stop it. But the worst part was seeing how all of this was affecting Sarah. She was already so fragile after Dad died, and this just pushed her over the edge. She stopped talking to almost everyone, shut herself off from the world. I tried to reach out, tried to be there for her, but she wasn't having it. She kept saying she needed time, that she needed to figure things out on her own. It was hard to watch. Sarah had always been the strong one, the one who knew what she wanted and went after it. But now she was lost, and I didn't know how to help her find her way back. She kept saying how much she regretted everything, how she wished she could go back and do it all differently. But we both knew that wasn't possible. As if all of this wasn't enough, the fallout from the divorce was ripping through the family. Mom was leaning on me more and more, needing help with the legal stuff, with the emotional fallout, and as much as I wanted to be there for her, it was hard. I couldn't shake the feeling that all of this could have been avoided if she hadn't left Dad in the first place. But what's done is done, and now we're all left to deal with the pieces. The family was split down the middle. Some were on Mom's side, saying she was the victim in all of this, that John had always been bad news. Others couldn't get past the fact that she'd been the one to start this whole mess by leaving Dad in the first place. It made for some really awkward family gatherings, with people taking sides and arguing about who was to blame. And then there was Sarah, caught in the middle of it all. She was angry at Mom for not seeing John's true colors sooner, angry at herself for not listening to everyone who tried to warn her. But more than anything, she was just sad. Sad that she'd lost so much, that she'd pushed away the one person who always had her back, Dad. I don't know where we go from here. The family feels broken in a way that I'm not sure can ever be fixed. Sarah's trying to rebuild her life, but it's clear she's struggling. She's in therapy, trying to work through everything, but it's going to be a long road. And Mom, well, she's trying to pick up the pieces too, but it's hard to feel sorry for her when she's the one who set this whole thing in motion. As for me, I'm just trying to keep it together. I've got my own family to think about, my own kids to raise, and I want to make sure they don't get caught up in all of this drama. But it's tough. Every time I look at Sarah, I see the sister I used to know, the one who was so full of life and ambition, and I wonder if she'll ever be that person again. So that's where we're at. No neat endings, no easy resolutions, just a family trying to figure out how to move forward after being torn apart one too many times. It's not pretty, and it's definitely not what I imagined for us, but it's the reality we're living in. Thanks to everyone who's been there with advice and support. It means more than you know, especially on the days when it feels like everything's falling apart. Here's hoping we can find some kind of peace in all of this, even if it's a long way off. And as I watched all this unfold, I wondered if there would ever be a way back for Sarah and Dad, or if some choices once made left scars too deep to ever fully heal.